in the way in which we manage concessions on public land.
Robertson.
Mr Chair, I actually wasn't going to take a call on this part, but the Minister's response has led me to do that, and it is around well, he is an inspiring man. It is around section 18122 and the question of reducing the time for objection or submission to 20 days in the case of a concession. And I think it's 2 points I want to make and then a question. The first point is the one is actually Eugenie Sage referred to it, but in passing, which is that we're talking about public land. That's the thing that makes this distinctive. While it's possible for RMA-related cases to have that, it has to be public land in this case because it's docks and docks' interest. And that's what makes it different. And going back and actually, I think Eugenie Sage might have been working on the Conservation Act in 1987 in a different guise. There was clearly an intent to make the time frame longer. 40 days is actually a very unusual time frame in terms of the law.
It's not a notice on a neighbouring gate.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. It's not a notice on a neighbouring gate, as David Parker says. We are talking about complex, often controversial concessions to public land being protected. It doesn't get much more important than that, and therefore 40 days is a sensible time period for that. And I think that is the distinction that's been missed here. And reading through the departmental report, Mr Chair, it's clear that the Department of Conservation, when it undertook its concessions processing review in 2010, went looking for ways to streamline the process of concessions. And there may well have been some justification around elements of that. What it says in the departmental report is they were looking for, as I say, ways to streamline the processes, increase transparency and reduce compliance costs. That is all very well and good. But as we have stated time and again in this debate in the last 2 days, all of this law, be it law within the Resource Management Act or here within the Conservation Act, is about striking the balance between the way in which we allow sustainable development to occur and facilitate the public to be involved. This is a classic piece, this clause, of unbalancing that situation. By all means, find ways, and there are in earlier clauses in this part, of streamlining the process, but let's not sacrifice the ability, as David Parker has noted, often of small-scale community groups to be able to participate in what is a large and significant, often, concession about public land. Now, having made that point, Mr Chair, and very much supporting David Parker's typescript, as they say, SOP on this matter, to return us to a 40-day level, I want to ask the Minister what consideration was given to submitters who came up with other alternatives, one of which was a 30-day time frame rather than the 40-day or 20-day, which would align it with some other pieces of legislation that have been passed by this House, or whether or not there was the ability to define large and complex concessions, which would be at 40 days, and then less complex concessions one at 20 days. Obviously, as Mr O'Rourke and Mr Parker have now both said. I would seek some feedback from the Minister, because it would seem to me that simply blanketly going from a 40-day process, which has been in place, we've just been celebrating the 30th anniversary of the Department of Conservation, it's been in place for 30 years, stood us in good stead as a country. To make that change on a blanket basis seems to me to deny the importance of that land to many New Zealanders and the importance of the process of going through and allowing time for submission. So, we oppose this part because of this clause, but I don't think I've heard a sufficient explanation from the Minister as to why he may not have considered some of those in-between options. But overall, this remains unfortunately symptomatic of this whole piece of legislation, that in the Minister's rush to appear to do something about issues within resource management, he's chosen to accept a reduction in the ability of the public to be involved in really important concessions about public land.
The Honourable Reece Dyson.
Thank you, Mr Chairman.